My name is Michael, and I live in New York. I want to tell you a story about something strange that happened to my family in Anchorage. Let me take you through it. Anchorage is a beautiful town surrounded by hills and forests. It's a popular place for tourists every year, but not everyone knows that behind its pretty mountains and trees, there are some scary stories people usually don't talk about. I'm going to share one of those stories with you today. It's about our house in Anchorage. It's in a quiet, remote area, and we often visit there for summer vacations or to enjoy the snow in the winter. But we mostly keep it locked up because we moved to New York for work and the kids' schooling. Whenever life in the city gets too loud and busy, we go to Anchorage to relax. Before this strange thing happened, we had never experienced anything unusual there. We hadn't been to the house in 2 years because of our busy lives, so it had stayed locked up all that time. When we decided to go again, we called some relatives to clean up the house since we planned to stay there for a few days. They got everything ready for us. There's my wife, our daughter, Luna, and our son, Adam, in our family. We packed up and left New York, excited to enjoy the peaceful surroundings in Anchorage. Our house is at the base of a hill, and when we arrived, everything seemed just as we remembered it. But when we stepped inside, there was something unsettling about the silence. It was so quiet, it felt like the house had been abandoned for years. We brushed it off, thinking it was just because we hadn't been there in a long time. We unpacked and settled in. Since we arrived late, we had brought food with us to eat. My wife warmed it up, and we had dinner before getting ready for bed. When we went to our bedroom, we noticed a strange coldness in the air. My wife wrapped herself up in a blanket, and the kids went to their own room. Later that night, Luna woke up and felt like someone was in their room. She whispered to Adam, "I feel like someone's here." Adam tried to calm her down, saying, "It's just your imagination. Say your prayers, blow on yourself, and close your eyes." Even though he tried to reassure her, Luna still felt scared and kept staring at the door. Eventually, we all drifted off to sleep, but we had no idea what was coming. During the day, everything seemed fine, and there was no strange feeling like there had been at night. But things would take a terrifying turn in the following days. After that first night, both kids started hearing weird sounds. Late at night, when everyone was asleep, there were soft knocks on the door. Sometimes, we'd hear whispers from the corners of the room. One night, while we were all asleep, Luna suddenly woke up and saw a shadow moving in the room. She was so scared that she couldn't move. Adam quickly woke Luna and asked, "Do you feel something strange?" Luna whispered back, "Yes, I feel it too." But since they were just kids, they tried to shake it off, thinking it was just their imagination, and went back to sleep. The next morning, when we woke up, we could tell something was off. The kids looked nervous and uneasy. My wife asked them, "What's wrong?" "You both look disturbed." Adam finally spoke up and told us everything. "Since we got here, we've been hearing strange sounds and seeing shadows," he said. I laughed it off, saying, "There's nothing like that. You're just imagining things." For the next few days, things seemed normal. But soon, we started noticing strange things. 2 things we thought were just in the kids' heads. At night, the house would get so quiet it felt eerie. And even during the day, strange things would happen that made us uneasy. Sometimes, things would go missing. Doors would open by themselves. One night, while the kids were in their room sleeping, Adam suddenly woke up. He saw a faint shadow in the corner of the room. He quickly turned on the light, and the shadow vanished the moment the room lit up. He was terrified, his heart pounding, but he didn't tell anyone, thinking it might have just been a bad dream. Adam, being the older and braver one, didn't want to scare anyone else, but when he told Luna about it, she admitted she'd been hearing strange noises too. It sounds like someone's opening a door or messing with a drawer. My wife started noticing these weird things too, but she didn't want to mention them, not wanting to frighten the kids more. But one night, something happened that she couldn't ignore. While she was in the kitchen, getting a drink of water, a cold wind suddenly blew in through the window. Along with the gust, she heard something like someone calling her name. She rushed to the window to check, but there was no one outside. Trying to shake off the feeling, she went back inside, keeping it to herself because she didn't want to add to the fear. At first, I brushed everything off as everyone's imagination. But one day, after meeting with some friends, I noticed something odd on the door. There was a strange mark that looked like it was made of blood. It didn't look normal at all. I was horrified. My mind went blank for a moment. I opened the door and told my wife about it. She didn't believe me at first, so I said, "Come outside, I'll show you." But when we went outside to look, the mark was gone. We were both shocked. I stood there, looking at the spot where the mark had been, not knowing what to think. My wife tried to calm me down, saying, maybe it was just your imagination, or a trick of the light. But I knew what I saw. I had looked at it closely. We checked the area around the door but found nothing. After that, we went back inside. That night, my wife had a dream. One night, my wife had a terrifying dream. In it, she found herself standing in the courtyard of the house. Out of nowhere, something appeared before her, floating in the air. It was a huge figure, about 10 to 12 feet tall, completely covered in black. Its face was hidden, but its red, glowing eyes stood out. The figure spoke to her in a chilling voice, saying, "Your arrival here will bring a new calamity." My wife woke up in a panic, drenched in sweat, her heart racing. She shook me awake and told me everything. I tried to comfort her, saying, "It was just a nightmare, don't worry. Say your prayers and try to sleep." Another time, my wife was alone in the room, sitting in front of the mirror, combing her long, beautiful hair. As she was combing, she noticed something strange in the reflection. Her heart dropped when she saw a distorted, eerie face staring back at her. Terrified, she jumped up and ran out of the room, screaming. We all rushed to her, just as scared. When I asked what happened, she hesitated before saying, "There's something in the mirror." I immediately checked the room, examined the mirror, and even looked behind the curtains, but found nothing out of the ordinary. I tried to calm her, saying you were alone, and maybe it made you anxious. That's all. But she was clearly shaken, and seeing her fear made the kids scared too. That night, she woke up again, this time seeing a woman standing silently in the corner of the room. The woman didn't move, but her eyes were locked on my wife's face. My wife's heart raced, and she sat up in bed, breathing heavily. She rubbed her eyes, but when she looked again, the woman was gone. She woke me up immediately, saying there was someone standing in the room. I turned on the lights and looked around, but there was no one there. Still, my wife insisted that she had seen someone clearly. The next morning, Luna seemed especially upset. She told us she'd had a strange dream. In it, she was locked in a room, and a girl stood in front of her, glaring at her with anger and hate in her eyes. The girl said, "Your parents will take you away from here, but I will never let you leave." Hearing this made all of us uneasy. I tried to reassure the kids, telling them there was nothing to be afraid of. I told my family not to worry, and reassured them that we would leave the house first thing in the morning. Things were getting worse by the day, and I wanted to get everyone out of there as soon as possible. After comforting everyone, we all tried to go back to sleep. In the middle of the night, I woke up, lying flat on my back, staring up at the ceiling. What happened next is something I can't even explain. My wife was floating near the ceiling, her body pressed against it, and her face was turned toward me. But her face, it was beyond horrifying. I was frozen in fear, unable to move or speak. The room was dark, with just a little light coming through the window, making her figure visible. She was floating closer to me, slowly descending, and I could feel my heart racing. The terror was so overwhelming. I started sweating, and it felt like my soul was leaving my body. As she came closer, she reached out with a burnt, disfigured hand toward my neck. Her face was charred, her eyes bulging in a grotesque way. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't even turn my head to see if my wife was actually beside me or not. In that moment of panic, I couldn't even remember any prayers or Quranic verses to say. Her grip tightened around my neck, and I thought I couldn't breathe. In sheer desperation, I shut my eyes and started silently reciting Quranic verses in my mind. The moment I did, she screamed, "I will take your daughter with me," and let go of my neck. When I opened my eyes, she was gone. I quickly turned to my side and saw my wife peacefully sleeping beside me. I shook her awake, and she muttered something. Seeing the state I was in, she immediately turned on the light, gave me water, and asked what had happened. I didn't answer. I just rushed to check on the kids. She followed me, terrified, as I turned on their room's light. Thankfully, they were sound asleep. I thanked Allah and hugged them tightly, waking them up to make sure they were okay. The kids were confused and scared, but I couldn't explain everything to them right then. My wife, still worried, asked me what happened. I simply said, "We need to leave this house immediately. I'll explain later." As soon as I finished speaking, the lights in the house began flickering. Doors and windows started slamming loudly. The sound of banging doors and flickering lights was unbearable. It felt like something was closing in on us. Children were crying uncontrollably, and we held them tight. My wife and I recited Quranic verses, but the fear in the air was suffocating. Shadows moved across the walls like figures running around. The terror was so intense, it felt like someone could appear in front of us or sneak up behind us at any moment. We stayed awake all night, paralyzed by fear, until the activity stopped just as the sun started to rise. As soon as daylight broke, we packed up quickly, locked the house, and left. When we got back home, our children's health began to deteriorate for several days. We sought spiritual help, had everyone prayed over, and slowly they started to feel better. We later arranged for a Quran recitation in the house, but the dark forces were so strong that they wouldn't leave. It was as if an entire family of spirits had taken over that place. I made the decision to seal the house and leave it abandoned. To this day, the house remains locked. I never sold it because my conscience wouldn't allow me to risk another family's life. What tormented us could never spare anyone else. Thank you for listening to my story. If you found it interesting, please share it. Stay tuned for another story. This story is about my mother, and it happened when she was 15 years old, about 35 years ago. At that time, my maternal grandfather had to move his family to a new city. The family moved houses several times before finally settling in one particular house, not knowing that this house would become the source of torment for them. At first, everything seemed perfectly normal. My grandfather had a good job, and life was running smoothly for a while. They lived in that house for about 5 to 6 months without any issues. But then, strange things began to happen. One cold winter night, the entire family was sitting together in one room, chatting as they often did, staying up late, talking, and enjoying each other's company. Suddenly, they heard loud noises coming from the kitchen. It sounded as if utensils were being thrown around and water taps were turning on and off. The family froze in fear, not knowing what could be causing such a ruckus when no one was in the kitchen. As my mother's brother got up to investigate, my grandmother stopped him, warning everyone to stay quiet and not make a sound. She advised them all to silently recite prayers in their hearts. After a while, the noises stopped. Later, 3 or 4 of them ventured to the kitchen to check, and when they looked, everything was in its place and the kitchen was empty. They tried to brush off the incident, thinking it might have been their imagination, and went to bed. However, the very next night, the same thing happened again around midnight. This time, even reciting prayers didn't stop the noises immediately. After some time, the sounds faded on their own. As the days passed, the family started to get used to these disturbances, although they still couldn't explain them. Despite the repeated incidents, my grandfather and grandmother chose not to consult any religious scholar or spiritual healer. They thought the disturbances would eventually stop, and over time, they did seem to lessen. By then, my mother had gotten married, and the family thought everything had returned to normal. But soon after my mother's marriage, the disturbances returned more intensely than before. It wasn't long before my grandmother's health began to deteriorate rapidly. The strange incidents had affected her so severely that she became bedridden. As the disturbances continued to escalate, the situation became even more terrifying for the family. My grandmother, who had once been a strong and independent woman, now needed constant support, especially at night. By 9 p.m., 2 people were required to help her move around, and whenever she needed to go to the washroom, my grandfather and one of my aunts would accompany her. One night, as my grandfather and aunt were helping my grandmother to the washroom, something terrifying happened. As they approached the washroom, someone seemingly invisible forcefully shoved my aunt aside. They couldn't see who or what it was. But the next moment, my aunt felt someone grab her hair and repeatedly slap her. She lost consciousness right then and there. When she regained her senses, her body was covered in marks and injuries, as if she had been attacked. A few days later, the same thing happened to another aunt. This attack was growing more violent, and the family was left in sheer terror. In response to these incidents, my grandfather took precautions. He told everyone not to leave their rooms after midnight, and my grandmother had to be taken to the washroom before the usual time. But the terror didn't stop. One day, my mother came to stay at the house. That evening, the electricity went out, and my aunt needed to go to the washroom. She took my mother with her, holding a candle. As they were walking, my mother noticed that my uncle, who had been away for a few days, was sleeping on the bed. He hadn't even bothered to take off his shoes. Worried about him, my mother took off his shoes and made him more comfortable. But when she told my aunt, look how tired he was, he came in and went straight to bed without even taking off his shoes. My aunt's face went pale. She looked at my mother and said, "Brother, where did he come from? He's been away for a few days." Both my mother and aunt were horrified, realizing that the person lying in the bed wasn't my uncle at all. My aunt grabbed my mother's hand and urgently told her, "We need to leave here immediately and not look back, no matter what happens. Even if we hear a sound, just run." The two women fled to another room, but as they ran, my mother heard someone calling her name from behind. She dared not turn around. Who knows what would have happened if she had looked back? After these harrowing experiences, my grandfather eventually bought a new house, and the family was finally freed from the terrifying incidents that had haunted them. My name is Roy, and I've shared a story about one of my sisters before. I work in a hospital in the UAE, but for some reasons, I can't mention its name. This story comes from the hospital where I work. For my living arrangement, I was given an apartment in a building with 60 apartments, but only 2 were occupied. Mine was the third one on the second floor. The entire floor was basically empty, with just my apartment. When I first moved in, everything was normal for a few days. But then, strange and scary things started happening. One night, I was lying in bed, watching a movie on my phone, when I suddenly heard knocking sounds coming from my wardrobe. Honestly, even talking about it now gives me chills. I got up, tried to be brave, and opened the wardrobe, but there was nothing there. I went back to bed and continued watching the movie. A while later, I heard knocking again, but this time it was coming from the main door. I thought maybe someone was at the door, but it was around 12:30 a.m., and I couldn't think of anyone who would come at that time. I opened the door, but no one was there. However, I could clearly hear someone walking outside. I got scared, quickly closed the door, and went back to my room. I said my prayers and somehow managed to fall asleep. The next day, I went to work, and when I returned after my shift, I ate dinner and laid down to rest. A little while later, I heard a woman laughing outside my room. I was terrified. I gathered my courage, went to check, but again, no one was there. You might not get why I was scared, but trust me, in that moment, I was shaking with fear. I went back to my room, trying to ignore it, and finally fell asleep. But the next morning, I woke up with scratch marks on my hands and face, like someone had scratched me with nails. This was something I'd never experienced before. As usual, I went to work, but the thought of going back to that apartment made me nervous. I tried to tell myself that I would sleep early that night and nothing would happen. But around 1 a.m., I felt something strange. It was like someone had come into the room and laid down on my bed. I could feel the mattress sinking down. Terrified, I quickly said my prayers, grabbed my keys, and rushed out of the apartment. I went to the security gate and told the guard everything. He said it was a common thing because the building was mostly empty. He offered me a place to sleep near the security office, so I spent the night there. The next morning, I went back to my apartment, packed my things, and went to work. I told my manager I couldn't stay in that apartment anymore. I ended up staying at a few friends' places outside the hospital after that, and I never spent another night there again. So, that's the stories. I hope you found it interesting. Now, close your eyes and relax.